Rabbi Menachem Penner and Rabbi Yakov Horowitz. Thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Pleasure to
Great to
be
be
here.
here.
Now, Rabbi Penner, Rabbi Yakov and I did an episode several months ago. I'm sure listeners remember. It was a very well-received episode. And I appreciate you joining us today and accepting our invitation to follow up on that first podcast to address some of the issues and questions that were raised as a result. Rabbi Horowitz shared with me some of the important questions he received after the first podcast, and I'd like to get your perspective on some of these issues as well as his. So first, I'm going to ask you a couple questions. I'll ask Rabbi Horowitz a couple questions, and then I'll address some to both of you, if that's okay. So I'd like to open up by asking you, what motivated you and your Rebbetzin and Rebbetzin Adeena to start Kesher Families?
Really, the volume of people that were reaching out to us anyway. Our son came out to us when he was 15, and we had really no one to reach out to till he was about 20. But at a certain point, people began to find out that we had a son who was gay. I was serving then as the dean of RIETS, the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary at YU. And enough people understood that there was a gay son in the family and that he was part of our family and that he was a beloved part of our family. And people just started reaching out to us. We'd get a text that says, can we speak to you about something? We'd like a few minutes of your time. And we began to understand what that meant, that they were looking to understand how we were squaring this. How could it be that we had a son who had chosen such a different path, and yet he was still part of our family? And at a certain point, we just realized we couldn't do this as sort of private citizens. It was just the volume was too great. And we also understood that the need, the things that people were looking for, was way beyond what we could do just by meeting people on the phone or at our dining room table.
That's very important to know. You mentioned that you were the dean of RIETS when your son came out to you. What was it like for you in such a high-profile position in the Orthodox world, as somebody who's the parent of someone who came out, who, as you say, has gone on a different path, and yet you have one of the most important roles in centrist Orthodox communal life?
It was very complicated. I was also serving as a shul rabbi in Queens. We had a very open-minded, loving, caring congregation, more like an out-of-town shul, so to speak, in Queens. So in the shul setting was sort of where we first played with it. People loved Gedalia. They knew him from birth. And they kind of figured out that something's going on in the rabbi's family. And I think that's where we first dealt with it. But it certainly was much more difficult in RIETS because certainly I would say the hashkafa of the yeshiva is probably to the right of the typical, modern Orthodox shul. And there was always a question in my mind, what are people thinking? And when he would come to meet me at my office, dressed sometimes in a long hair and a tank top, what did that mean? At a certain point, I began to feel that the message of loving Jews and of loving your own child was probably as important a hashkafic message as any. And I think that's one thing that we found, and one thing that we try to assure parents, that it's not simple. It's not simple to know what to do. It's not simple to know how to handle these relationships. But as much as there are people who will look down on you because you have a relationship, there probably are a lot more people that will look up to you because you're willing to keep that relationship. And at the end of the day, I think the most important thing was that, our son Gedalia was part of our family. And ultimately more important to us than any position that we held. Now, it's easy to say that, but push comes to shove. My wife and I understood that at the end of the day, we weren't going to give up our relationship with our son because there was community pressure to do that, or because it might, send the wrong impression. And that at the end of the day, if it did send the wrong impression, not that I think it did, but if it did send the wrong impression, it would be more important to step down from a position than to give up the relationship with the child. There are other people who could be, and now are, not related. Now I'm the executive vice president of the RCA. There are other people who could be the dean of RIETS and are now the dean of RIETS, but there's nobody else who could be Gedaliah's father. And I think that, very often there's a lot more kavod in the public positions that we hold. But there is one job that we have that's pretty irreplaceable.
That's
The
such an
famous
important
idea.
message.
Yeah, there's a famous idea by Rabbi Soloveitchik where Avram Avinu, especially because he spent so many years without a child and so many years doing kiruv and so many years being the Gadol Hador, and it was very difficult for Avram Avinu to realize once he had Yitzchak that ki bi Yitzchak yikarei l'chazera, not Yitzchak as opposed to Yishmael. Yitzchak as opposed to what the Rambam says were tens of thousands of Balei Tshuva, and for him to realize that ultimately his role as Yitzchak's father was his most important role. And historically, that's so. We don't know what happened with the Nefesh Asher Asu B'Charan, but everything he has came from this one son that he put his efforts into. So again, it's easier to say these things. It's easier to say these things in a drasha, but I can say that they were certainly in the backs of our minds to understand that this was the proper path that we needed to take.
Let me ask you a follow-up on that. When you described Gedaliah coming in, not dressed in a yeshivish way, let's say, when he would come to your office, is there some fundamental difference, in your opinion, when a child, for example, goes off the derech versus when someone says that he's gay, for example? In other words, how is that experience different fundamentally than any other situation where a child simply is not following in the path of his parents?
Right. It's more complicated in certain ways, and it's easier in certain ways. There are many young people today who identify as gay, who have same-sex attraction, and feel that that's the life that they're going to leave. That's the family life. That's the partner they're going to have, but are otherwise intending to live completely frum lives. And they dress as one would, in a more yeshivish way or a more typical Orthodox way. They intend to live their life completely otherwise. That conundrum, that stira of, on the one hand, saying this is something that I'm going to do my best with, but I'm not going to live up to what the halacha says, probably. Again, I don't want to speak for anyone in particular, but that otherwise I'm going to completely engage in Yiddishkeit, and do my best. So that's very different than a child who's, let's say, quote unquote, going off the derech, right? Everyone stays on the derech somewhat. Everybody keeps doing certain mitzvahs. Everybody has a Yiddish neshama, but it presents, much differently. What's so interesting, skipping a little bit to what we've learned from so many of the parents that we deal with, is I cannot tell you how many times a parent from a Hasidic home will say, I can accept that my child is gay. I can't deal with the fact that they don't have a kesher with Hashem. And we're talking about families who the concept of a gay child or a transgender child was the furthest thing from their radar before their child came out to them. But 6 months in, or a year in, or 5 years in, I cannot tell you how many times parents say that to us, that I just wish my child could just have a relationship with Hashem, could just otherwise have a connection to Yiddishkeit. Now, of course, you can, but of course, I don't blame someone who, because of the feelings they have and the feelings of the Jewish community about this, just feel they can't make it work. But those are really two very different things. My son Gedaliah was very, very, very respectful, but there were certain things where he just needed to be himself. He was a student at YU at the time. He didn't walk into YU that way. He didn't dress that way when he started, but at a certain point, it was just, he wasn't going to change his clothing. He wasn't going to pull an Esav when he came to visit his father. He wasn't going to just pretend to be somebody that he wasn't, and I wouldn't have wanted him to. So if that's the way he dressed all day long, that's the way he should dress when he comes to see his Abba. But of course, it made, obviously, for some uncomfortable situations. But it was my problem. He was being him. And I had to, grow to realize that that's my son, and I do love him, and I want him here, no matter how he's going to come to my office.
Again, such important messages. And it could be, Rabbi Penner, you already answered this implicitly, but I'll ask it explicitly anyway. Could you explain your decision to share your family's journey publicly?
It was a very difficult decision, and I still hope it was the right one. Um, but we just felt that if we could share the love that we had for each other and share the path that we had chosen with many, many other people, the podcast I did with my son was listened to 40, 50,000 times already. We meet many, many people who we'd never have any contact with. That's the power of a podcast, who wouldn't necessarily come up and talk to us, but are able to listen. And we just felt that if some of the lessons that we learned could help people get there more quickly, or help people get to a place that maybe they didn't think they could get to, that we had to do that. It's almost as if we had a secret. We had uncovered a secret that your child could choose a very different path than you, and you could still love each other, and you could still inhabit the same space, and you could still respect each other. It shouldn't be a big secret. Certainly, it's something Rabbi Horowitz has been trying to teach people for a very long time. But for many people, it was a secret. And it was irresponsible, I think. There are people who, of course, told me it was irresponsible to speak publicly. But we thought it was irresponsible not to share, not to share that idea, not to give people hope. So with great trepidation, we recorded. Not everything on every podcast is every word that was said in the actual recording itself. We edited a little bit. But I think people really got to hear from me. People really got to hear from Gedalia. And we know that it changed many, many people's lives.
Absolutely.
And that's what's just so gratifying. As I mentioned before, we didn't speak to anyone for 5 years. Rabbi Chaim Rappaport, who now is an integral part of our staff from London, was the first person that we spoke to in 5 years. And we really thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we didn't ruin our relationship with Gedalia in those 5 years, or ruin Gedalia. We made a lot of mistakes, but to imagine that someone could get this message a few days after their child comes out, instead of 5 years after their child comes out, that's the power of the recording, and that's also the power of Kesher Families. When someone calls us up in a panic that their child came out to them 3 days ago, like, imagine what our lives would have been like if we had someone to speak to in 3 days instead of 5 years.
Wow, how important. And let me ask, in addition to what you just mentioned, you talk about the lessons that you learned and want to transmit. Are there any others in particular that you think are important to share right now with people listening? Lessons apart from the idea of love and acceptance, which is a big one and is very, very important. I'm not downplaying it. Are there some other messages that you'd like to make sure people hear?
There are a few things that we stress, and I'll say them, in brief. First, we try to stress to our parents that parenting is a shlichus from Hashem. I think that many parents that come to us feel that when they stick with their child, they have to decide between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and their child. And what we try to explain to them is it couldn't be further from the truth. It doesn't mean that everything is permitted. It doesn't mean you could be there for everything in your child's life. But you are HaKadosh Baruch Hu's shaliach for your child. He wants you to be in uncomfortable places and spaces as his shaliach. We try to stress to parents that parenting isn't about winning or losing. And that's such a struggle when a child takes a different path in your home. My rules, my home, my rules. Well, nothing wrong with rules. But when you have to choose between my rules or my child, then you really have to decide what's most important. And that was something we really had to learn over the years. Gedalia was being very respectful, but needed to be himself slowly, needed to come out. And we needed to learn the difference between, what we needed and what Gedalia needed to be able to remain part of the family and to remain part of the home. Perhaps the other thing we try to speak to parents most about is the need to be nosei ba'ol with your child. that to carry the burden with your child, that no matter how your child grapples with their identity, if it's not a typical identity in the Orthodox community, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. And very often it's a challenge that parents can't, quote unquote, fix. And they have to remember that part of their role is not to fix it. And in fact, many of the children don't want it to be fixed. And I don't know how to fix it, even if we could fix it. The word fix is the wrong word, change. Very often it's just about being there for your child. Your child's experiencing something that most people in the Orthodox community don't experience. And the question is not, what's the next step for the child? But first and foremost, can I really listen to my child? My wife was the forerunner in our family in terms of this area. We loved Gedalia, but we weren't really willing to listen to him, to understand where he was coming from, to really share the challenges. And it's hard. But once we learned that that's part of also what it means to be a parent, not just to give direction, but to be there, to be a listening ear, to love and to care and to support, even if you don't have all the answers. And we don't have all the answers, whether it's as parents or as rabbis. We don't have all the answers for many of these individuals. But showing that you care, being willing to listen, being willing to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, that is a tremendous chesed, and it's not simply the role of a mentor advisor, it's a role of a parent. So a lot of what we talk about is really just being a parent, things that we had to learn. Some of your listeners here may say, well, I know that you have to listen to your child and you're going to have to lose sometimes if you want to retain the relationship. We had to learn that. And if us being transparent and sharing the lessons that we had to learn and the mistakes that we made, if that can have other families avoid those pitfalls, so it's worth whatever embarrassment or or people saying, why are you so public? Shouldn't we not talk about these things? They're real issues in real families, in real Yiddish families, in real loving families. And we're just there to share what we went through to help other families.
Okay, thank you very much, Rabbi Penner. We'll come back to you in a moment. I first want to ask Rabbi Horowitz about the reaction to our first podcast that we did together in August. We're going to talk about some specific questions that people asked or specific feedback, but I'd like to ask you, Rabbi Horowitz, in general, how would you describe the feedback you received overall to that conversation?
Yeah, thank you. And it's an honor to be on with Rabbi Menachem and Rabbi Adeena. We become very, very close. And I got to tell you, for everyone out there, Rabbi Menachem and Rabbi Adeena represent the holiness of raising children that requires you to step back and rethink and with the North Star there, that we're going to be there for our children, that this is our mission. Whenever I'm in the presence of parents who have LGBT kids, especially by the Kesher Shabbaton, the whole Shabbos I was humming to myself. There's a beautiful Chazal quote from our sages that it's an Aramaic, and people sing their song on Shavuos and Simchas Torah when we accept the Torah and celebrate with the Torah. It says that Hashem says, Kad Yasvin Yisrael, when the Bnei Yisrael, when the Jewish people are when the Jewish people study the Torah and celebrate with the Torah, Hashem says, to the angels around them, however we understand this. Look at my beloved children. They set aside their own pain, their own confusion, from exile, from poverty, from life, from dealing with the vicissitudes of life. They set that aside, and they're involved with my Torah, with my happiness, and they're celebrating learning the Torah. My overriding feeling is humility, to be in the presence of people who are all setting aside that entire spectrum of feelings and thoughts and everything that's going on in their minds, and they set that aside to focus on the children. And I can't think of anything holier than that. I was humming it all Shabbos. My wife says, "All right, Yankee, knock it off already." I kept saying, it's so true. Chassul, look at. I am sure that Hashem has such nachas from Menachem and Adeena and the other parents, because it's nice to say kids first, care for kids, and then the rubber meets the road. And look, none of us are perfect. We all make mistakes, but it's inspiring. It really is. So, what was the feedback? A lot of people told me, "Oh, you're going to get whatever." Almost overwhelmingly positive. Some people take issues with one thing here or there, but the vast, overwhelming majority of responses, I would say 99%, were all positive. Thank you for talking about it. Thank you for bringing it. Whether it was parents that had LGBTQ children or others who don't, all reasonable people appreciate the fact that we're talking about it because it's so important. And I think the nicest part of it in some way, our first podcast together, and I want to thank you again, Rabbi Scott, for giving us this opportunity. We had a huge spike in membership to Kesher as a result of that. So that was the nicest thing about it, that people took the opportunity who were sitting there on the fence and thinking about, either didn't know that there was something like this, or it gave people like a bump to be able to come forward and seek help. Many people told me that they have friends that have LGBTQ kids, and that they were kind of like, they weren't sure what to say. Do you say, don't? It's complicated, right? And they picked up a phone or went over to the house and gave their friends a hug. So that's what it's all about. That's what Kesher Families is all about. It's about offering parents an opportunity to get guidance and also to seek help from each other, to learn peer-to-peer learning, and to be able to have a safe space to talk where people can understand you. Look, I work in this space. I would be lying if I told you that I understand the lives of the Penners or the other parents of LGBTQ kids. I'd like to think that I do my very best to understand it, but how could I? But when parents get together for the Shabbos or any of the drop-in groups, they do so many services. And everybody out there, I just spoke to a parent yesterday who called me that they have an LGBTQ child, and I'm okay. She said, I have to have a therapist. I said, try it. Go to one drop-in call. So that you can experience the comfort of just being able to talk. You don't have to explain anything to anybody there because they all get it already. And nobody outside, as much as we want to, we don't get it. That's just the way life is. So thank you again for doing it, and thanks for having us back.
Well, I appreciate that. It's nice to hear that Kesher did have a spike. That's something which I didn't know, and I appreciate hearing. That's really good news. Now, I'm going to address some of the feedback to both of you, Rabbi Penner and Rabbi Horowitz, and whoever would like to take it could explain it. One thing that Rabbi Horowitz told me that he heard was a comment on the fact that he said in our first episode that he refrains from commenting on public policy positions and instead focuses on issues related to parenting LGBTQ children. I assume by public policy positions, you mean something like maybe giving an aliyah in shul, or I don't know exactly what you were referring to, things of that sort. So I wanted to know if you could explain why that's your policy, and as well, if that is the official position of Kesher Families.
Rabbi Penner, why don't you talk about
I'll
Kesher
speak from the
Families?
official position.
Right. And
It is the official of Kesher Families for a variety of reasons. First of all, these issues of public policy need to be determined by, first of all, individual shul rabbanim and by poskim. And that's not really our role. Our role is to try to help those who are making these decisions to understand the metzias, to understand the reality. Any psak, any public opinion has to be a combination of understanding the tradition and matching that with the metzias of what's going on. Our role is not to, we're not coming in the place of poskim, though I don't want to diminish Rabbi Horowitz. I don't want to diminish Rabbi Rappaport, who is in certain ways a posek, but that's not really our role to weigh in on those issues. But we do speak publicly and we do speak privately to many rabbanim and organizations to just try to help them understand what this is, and more importantly, what it's not. To just be able to get your hands around what this reality is of same-sex attraction, of people who want to dress differently, people who feel they're in the wrong body, whatever that would be, however we understand transgender. So our goal is to sort of take the collective wisdom that we're seeing. We've seen over 300 families. We've heard their cases. We've spoken to so many individuals, and to try to distill that and give a sense of what's going on. At that point, that's going to be up to the community. The other thing is that if you really want to help, you really have to choose a lane. You have to choose where you think you can be most helpful. The goal of Kesher Families is not to be activist, is not to push for change. I wear the two hats. I'm very involved in this area. I'm a parent, and I'm also a rabbi of a national rabbinic organization. You don't push for change when it comes to halacha. That's not the way it works. You can educate, you can let people understand what it is. But I think that even if we were qualified, I would say, to step into that area, which I don't think we are, I think that it would take away from what our real goal is, to make sure that the families are intact. The reality is, it will never be simple for someone who identifies as LGBTQ. It will never be simple to be part of the Orthodox community. There will be issues that come up. There will be things that have to be navigated. And what our feeling is that if the family is there, if the family is intact, if the parents are there for the child, they have much of the emotional support that they need. If the parents cannot be with the child, if the siblings check out, if et cetera, then we're very concerned for the mental health of the individual, for the safety of the individual, for the future of the individual, for the neshama of the individual, and what that means. So families also, it'll never be completely simple, but if we can hold that family unit together and we get involved not simply in working with the parents, but working with siblings, working with grandparents, working with how to navigate a simcha where there's going to be the wider family there. If we can hold the family together, then we're able to provide a lot of the support that the individual needs. Community issues, they vary so much by community, by individual, and I'll just say one more thing. We say this all the time. Not every shul is going to be the right place for every individual, whether they be straight, whether they be LGBTQ, whether they be Hasidish, YU, Man, Balchuv. Not every shul needs to be for every individual. They should be open and welcoming, but they don't need to be there for everyone. It's fair to say, you're welcome here in this shul, but there actually is another shul that might be even more welcoming, or might be even more exactly what you're looking for. But you can't say to your child, there's another home down the block that's going to be even more welcoming for you. Maybe I'm not the rabbi for you, but I'm the father that HaKadosh Baruch Hu chose for you, and you chose this as he chose you as my child. So I think that we need to sort of have one approach. Doesn't mean we don't need to be welcoming. It doesn't mean we don't need to be thinking about these issues. But I think there's a difference between being there as a parent and being there as a community. And I think we need to have almost two different approaches to the way we deal with this.
Before moving forward to Rabbi Horowitz, I just want, Rabbi Penner, you to explain one thing that you said before. You said it's important to talk to Rabbanim to explain to them what this is and what it's not. What do you mean by what it's not?
It's a good question, what it's not. I think that, from what we've come to understand, let's talk about gay and gay men. What the attraction to the same sex as opposed to the attraction to the opposite sex seems to be, and sexuality itself seems to play the same role, certainly within individuals in the frum community, as it does in heterosexual relationships. In other words, imagine that the role of sexuality in relationships, the role of sexuality in love, imagine that it was the same thing as this and plays the same role as it would in a heterosexual relationship, and it does in a homosexual relationship. That doesn't make it mutter. That doesn't mean it's okay. But to begin to understand that what many of these individuals are looking for are exactly the same things that people who are heterosexual are looking for. My wife once had a conversation with our son Gedalia, and every case is different and every person is different. One of the turning moments in our relationship with him, or the most eye-opening thing, my wife, when she saw that he was starting to date men, and it's hard to say that, but he was starting to date men for tachlis. Like he was dating men to try to find someone to marry. And to us at that time, that was such an oxymoron. Like, what could that mean? Like, what is that? And my wife said to him, like, where are you going with all of this? Like, what's your plan? I mean, it was sort of one of those turning moments where it looked like he was just heading into a very different life, which he did and he is. And she said to him, what's wrong with what we have here? Like, why are you rebelling? She didn't say it in so many words, and Gedalia looked her in the eyes and said, Mommy, I want all the same things that you and Abba have. I want a family. I want a Shabbos table. I want love. I can't have that with a woman. I'm just not attracted to women. I need to say this again and again. Just because you're not attracted to women doesn't make it mutter to have a certain type of relationship with a man. But to understand was so difficult for us to understand is that he was seeking a relationship with a man to have a family, to have a Jewish family. Again, it doesn't mean it's okay. Careful. And that's why it's so hard to talk about these things publicly. But understanding that what he was seeking was the same thing that we were seeking for when we started to date was mind-blowing to us. He actually wasn't seeking to rebel against the family. He was trying to figure out how to be as much like his family, his Rabbinical family, as he could be. And for him, this was the way he could do it. What do you say to that? He is a chazan, basically an assistant rabbi in a conservative shul. His davening is unbelievably uplifting. He's bringing people closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Our children are, thank God, Bli Ayin Hara, exceptional in many, many ways, involved in many, many ways, mostly in the field of chinuch. He's the one that went into the family business. He became, what am I going to say? How bizarre could this be that he calls me up to go over the last minute thing. He's going to say a hesped at the kvura. So what is he going to say? Is this what people told my wife and I when we were in Sheva Brachas? That this is what it means that you should have a bayis neman b'Yisrael and your kids should follow in your derech and all the platitudes and crazy things they said about us? That was not what they had in mind. And it doesn't mean that there aren't Torah issues, Torah things to grapple with, and that we can't give a hechsher to this. But it does mean it's not what we think it is. It's not simply the seeking of the sexual outlets, and it can be with some people, but with many people, it's not. It's not something he chose.
I'm sorry.
Let me just say this one other thing. We also came to understand it's not something he chose. He chose where to go with it, and everyone has bechira chavshis, but he didn't choose to be gay. He would have much preferred to be attracted to the opposite sex. It would have made his life much simpler and made it much easier to follow the derech that he would have wanted to follow. So these are just some of the things that we try to explain. Chas v'shalom, not trying to explain why anything is us or mutter, but just what it is and who these individuals are that are coming before us, asking to stay part of the Jewish community. The answers aren't simple, but it starts with understanding what it is. I'm so sorry, Rabbi Horowitz.
No. I wanted to tell Rav Scott that now where I heard that story from, that I mentioned that in the Rabbi Menachem, I mentioned it in the first podcast that somebody told this to his mother. Because I remember when I heard it from you and Adeena, it was so moving to me. And it was,
It moved us. It just,
yeah,
it changed
yeah,
everything.
right,
It
right.
just,
And about this public policy thing, I decided to keep that, that firewall in all my interactions, privately and publicly, because, in other words, if a rabbi or a principal will call me, and they do, and say, look, we have an LGBTQ student, and we want to know what to do, of course, I help them, and I do see that as my role if people want that information. But all schools are different, all communities are different, and the pragmatic part of me is I tell people that when people come in, when LGBTQ adults, children, parents, they say, listen, our shul won't. Well, there are places that will, and there are, or like Rabbi Penner said before, there are shuls and communities and schools that will be more accepting. And my advice, certainly on a personal level, is that they should go where they're more comfortable. If they feel rejection, it's not going to help their spirituality and connection to Hashem if they go to a place where there's negative energy. And what happens over the course of time, time will tell. But I just did not find it productive to get into that space. By being public about this, meaning joining Kesher, or even 7, 8 years beforehand, I was involved in this space and sometimes spoke about it publicly. It was an invitation to educators and leaders of communities and board members that to come talk to me. I'm in this space. Feel free to talk to me. I don't know, but I don't think it's helpful for me to get into that.
That makes sense. And in fact, Rabbi Penner, the story you just told about your son wanting the same things that you and your wife have in your family, he can't do it with a woman, but the values that you embodied and inculcated in your family remained values that he cared about and cares about. And I'm just mentioning this now because in a recent episode of a different podcast, which I do with my co-host Tali Rosenbaum called Intimate Judaism, this issue came up in the LGBTQ space. And I am assuming you'll agree, you can comment if you don't, or you can comment either way, that it's important, we said, that even if somebody, as you said, they don't choose to be gay, but they do choose the lifestyle that they're going to go on after that, they choose a specific derech within that, that just because they might choose a lifestyle that isn't in accord with the demands of the Torah, that doesn't mean that the other values that are associated with Torah have to go as well. It doesn't mean that they should just say, well, at this point, to put it in extreme terms, I'm not religious anymore. Therefore, they would never say, well, therefore I shouldn't keep Shabbos or Kashrut. But also, even in the realm of, let's call them sexual ethics, it doesn't mean that those should just be chucked in the garbage as well. Chas v'shalom, meaning, okay, we
right.
all are doing different things. We all do the best we can, but it's not a binary that once on a sexual level, someone says, I'm not going to keep everything that the Torah demands, I should therefore keep nothing that the Torah demands. Do you agree with that statement?
That's obvious that that should be true, that we're all trying to do the best we can in every area. And people are going to make decisions in their lives. But there's no reason to think that a Kadosh Baruch Hu would want that. That if a person feels that because of their circumstances, there's an area that they need to choose a different path than a typical Torah path, that why should that, mean that they can't be otherwise as fully engaged as possible? I mean, that goes back to the Rambam. He discusses that in his letter to Yemen. There's a Geret Teiman, which is a very different situation, but we certainly encourage people to do that. And the fact is, we even encourage people to do that when it comes to where they're going to be on Shabbos morning. I've had individuals who've come and spoken to me and said, I can't be in an Orthodox shul on Shabbos morning. I can't do it. So I'm going to go to a conservative shul. And therefore, I'm going to otherwise keep halacha in line with conservative Judaism. And I say to them, why does where you go for 2 hours a week determine the entire relationship you're going to have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Torah?
And
I'm not telling you where to go. I'm not telling you where to go to shul. That you feel that that's where you're comfortable and that's what makes sense for you. Okay. But what does that have to do with kashrut? Not that there aren't people who are conservative Jews who keep kashrut, but whatever that meant for him, that everything needed to be exactly the same. Said, why would you take such an approach? I want to also be careful. Again, I think that very often when we think about gay relationships, lesbian relationships, we very often overplay the sexual aspect of it. That's part of what I was speaking about. Obviously, the break from tradition, the potentially surim, whether they're deraisa, they're rabbanan, are in that area. But I think sometimes when we come off in these discussions, we come off as speaking about their relationships as simply sort of sexual relationships. And that's kind of what I was speaking about before, that they are just as sexuality is not the core of any marriage. It's also not the core of a relationship between two people who are gay. So we have to sort of sometimes use that phrase sexuality, but I want to be clear to our listeners that it's a relationship, and sexuality plays one role in that relationship. One thing that was so hard for us to understand for so many years was and it's going to sound absurd what I'm about to say, the connection between sexuality and love. That just as a man who is not attracted to a woman, that people can begin to accept the concept. Just as a man is not able to be, just as a particular man may not be attracted to women, he couldn't fall in love with any woman. I say sometimes to rabbis, I say, imagine your best friend from yeshiva. Could you imagine falling in love with that friend? And they get it. You can't, without attraction, there's also no love. What is the connection deep in the mind? How did HaKadosh Baruch Hu put it together? But we can get that someone who is not attracted to women also can't be in love the way we understand it. Baruch Hashem, those of us who are blessed with loving marriages, or even those who seek loving marriages, can get it. They also can't find love with the opposite sex.
Right.
And when we speak about these individuals, people who are looking for love and intimacy, and not just looking at it for sex, we begin to understand a little bit better the challenge, the struggle, the decisions that they make. It doesn't mean we can't objectively look at some of the things in their life and say, well, this can't be permitted according to the Torah. But when we judge them, or we say, I would have done something differently, or we try to figure out their motivation, and we understand that they're looking for something which all of us are really looking for.
Right.
You look at things. It doesn't change halacha. It doesn't mean that, therefore public policy is X, Y, Z. But it does very much change the way that we understand them. And it's very helpful for parents to understand that in terms of the way they look at and understand their own children.
Yep. And, Rabbi Menachem, when people discuss this component of it, like I'm not willing to live alone. Someone says, I'm not willing to live alone all my life. And this prohibition in the Torah is not, I just can't do it. Like, what should I do? And the assumption is, so then toss it all out. I asked them, I said, what would you do if you had a child who came to you, teenage kid, a young adult? He said, listen, I'm not giving up my phone on Shabbos. I love you. That in the vernacular, it may take some of the sting out of LGBTQ. I always try to give analogies that are off the subject, so people can be can approach it more rationally. I said, if your child, son or daughter, came to you and said, listen, Mom, Dad, I'm not giving up my phone on Shabbos at this point in my life, or whatever, I just can't do it. So would you tell them just to go to the beach? So then there's no point in you being religious if you're doing that. I can't imagine anyone who would say that. So, the same concept could apply here also. One of my good friends who's a Chabad Shliach, who's a Chabad rabbi and a Lubavitcher rabbi, he told me that a man went to Lubavitcher Rebbe. He happened to know who it was, and told him that he told the Rebbe that, look, I'm gay. I just don't know what to do as far as my religion. So the Rebbe told him, he said, there are lots of other mitzvahs. That's what he told him. That was his response to him. There are lots of other mitzvahs, positive commandments, and what Rabbi Menachem said also, I just want to support that. I mentioned to you in the first podcast, my wife Odi and I, when I first started working in this space, like almost 10 years ago, I realized that the learning curve for me was like really steep, and I didn't know anything about anything. I just wanted to help the kids. We invited 12, 15 LGBTQ young men and women to our home for a 3-hour lunch on a Sunday. I knew one of my former students was gay, and I called him up. I said, do me a favor, give me a cross-section of people, gay, lesbian, or whatever. I'd like to get to know your lives. I'd like to know how I could be of help, because more and more parents were reaching out to me. I said, what am I missing? What don't I know? One of the young women there, she said, Rabbi, everybody thinks that it's all about sex for us. It's who we are. She said, I'm different than my sisters. I'm different than my classmates in school. So, and that difference is such a big gulf that I can't even bridge it. So we're just trying to figure things out. Would you assume that people our age are having sex and who are heterosexual? If you saw an 18-year-old, 17-year-old kid, would you assume that that's what they're doing? It's not. It's not like that's not what it is. We're just trying to figure. Of course, there's a intimacy component also, but it's that we're different. It was very helpful to me in understanding a lot of this, the way Rabbi Penner was discussing.
I think it's actually in a certain way a weakness in our belief in our Masorah to say that if they're truly different, then that would necessarily change halacha. I think Adarabba, I think that we can be strong to say that we recognize that this isn't just an attraction. This is something that's real. We take them at their word. This is they feel fundamentally different. This is the Metzias. And yet the Torah doesn't change because of that.
Right.
I think that this fear that if we would accept that they're so different, if we would accept that they're real, that would mean that the Torah, no, it doesn't mean that the Torah. This is the Metzias. We can still accept them for who they are. We could still have podcasts where we explain what it's not. And we shouldn't have to fear as a Jewish community that means that somehow the Ribbon Shalom is wrong. The Ribbon Shalom can't be wrong. We have to grapple with it for what it is and not make it easier. There's one other thing I want to add about that chiluk of everything or nothing. There's another chiluk, and I don't recommend to individuals taking this chiluk, but sometimes it's necessary. Someone will come to me and they'll say, what do you want me to do? There's no place for me in the Orthodox community. And the first thing I'll tell them is, there are places in the Orthodox community. Just because it isn't the shul that X would daven in, it doesn't. So I don't want to. But then I say, Lu Yitzur, there wasn't any place for you in the Orthodox community. That doesn't mean you have no place in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's eyes, and you can't have a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And don't mistake the attitude of the Orthodox community for the attitude of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Jews can make a lot of mistakes, and I'm not here to say people are making mistakes, they're not making mistakes. But don't confuse the Jewish community with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It could be that there are things in the Jewish community that make it difficult. It could be that we don't know exactly how to do it. It could be that, again, on a public policy range, we don't know exactly what to make of it and how to do it. But don't mistake our confusion for HaKadosh Baruch Hu's confusion. And don't mistake bad vibes that we may be accidentally giving, or if we say the wrong word, or if we do something imperfect, don't mistake that for HaKadosh Baruch Hu being imperfect. And even if you get to the point where you feel you can't participate in certain aspects of the Jewish community is just one aspect of your connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves you. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created you. HaKadosh Baruch Hu understands you. Doesn't mean that because he understands you, he doesn't care what mistakes, what decisions you make. We all make mistakes, whatever it's going to be. But sometimes we need to actually create that division, not just between all the mitzvos and some of the mitzvos, but my public Jewish life, which is going to naturally be more challenging of how we grapple with these issues in a public sphere, and my personal relationship with Hashem, my personal observance. If a person says to me, like we talked about before, I just don't feel comfortable in shul, that should have nothing to do with the person feels that they should keep kashrus, so they should daven at home. At the same time, I totally get it if you're mad at the Ribono Shel Olam. You can only be mad at the Ribono Shel Olam if you believe he's there and you believe he's good. Being angry at HaKadosh Baruch Hu is part of the relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I cannot blame or judge someone who says, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu does this to me, then X, Y, and Z. But if a person is able to move through that, and they're able to retain their relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and they're able to both at the same time be upset and angry, but realize that that anger comes from the place that you believe that Hashem is good, and you just don't understand him, but that he continues to love you, then you can continue to have an exceptional relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I think it's important to stress that.
If I can add one thing to that, and perhaps this is incorrect, but in the story we read a few weeks ago, when Abraham was arguing with Hashem on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah, saying, shall the judge of all the earth not act justly? And he argued with Hashem, essentially bargaining him down until if 10 people are there who are righteous, will you not destroy the city? Ultimately, Abraham wanted Hashem to save the city. And a key point is after the city was destroyed, there's a pasuk stuck in the middle where Abraham gets up as Lot is leaving the city. And it says he looked out. He went to the same place he'd been the day before, which of course is the source for Shachris and Makom Kavua. And he watched the entire plane going up like a furnace. And Abraham is wordless. I wonder, I don't have proof for this, but I wonder what Abraham was feeling at that time. It may very well have been anger at God. And yet, at that moment, he doesn't say a word. He doesn't say it's okay. He doesn't say it's not okay. But what he davened for didn't really work. Yes, Hashem said, okay, if there are 10, but his ultimate goal to save the city did not receive a positive affirmative answer. And he stood there, and that's left on its own. And yet, that moment of, I'll say, perhaps midrashically, potential anger, who knows what Avram was thinking, is the source of Shachris. That's the source of Makom Kavua.
It's the source of Shachris, and it's also the source, if you think about it, it's the source of davening every day, inside and out. It's interesting that that Gemara talks about 3 different requests of the Avos at a time where they needed something. Right? Each one has a context. But Chazal say they were mesakein to daven every day. And there's a difference between just coming to HaKadosh Baruch Hu when you need something and saying that whether this is a good day or a bad day, or I feel I have something I need, or I feel I don't, or whether I'm happy with God or I'm upset with him, I'm going to do it every day. That was the chiddush of the Avos. The idea of turning to Hashem when I need something. Everybody prays in a foxhole. But the chiddush of the Avos was to keep in that relationship. Again, I'm not here chas v'shalom to judge someone whose anger over the different situation that they have makes it difficult. We can't appreciate what it means to feel those kinds of feelings. But we can still assert that these individuals have a very special role in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that they have a special tafkid in the world. People mistakenly think that if they have a different life than most people, if they look in at the Jewish community and they say, most people have this, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't love me. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives you a different situation because he loves you more. That's easy to say and not easy to feel. I had a conversation recently with a big Rav who was speaking about this, and he confided with me. He said, in my opinion, these individuals are special ops. They're special ops. And he said to us, me and my wife, you guys are also special ops. You don't ask to be in special ops. You'd rather have a neat job. I was speaking to a kid once in my office. He was going to stay for the army in Israel, and he felt he couldn't because of his attractions. And he's like, why doesn't HaKadosh Baruch Hu want me? I said, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants you for something different and something that's even more difficult than what your peers were doing. I don't know how you struggle with this. I don't know how you're going to deal with it. But realize that if you were put in a special situation, that's a sign of love, tough love. It's a sign of certainly believing in you, that you can do something that the average person is not asked to struggle with and to be with. And again, it's so easy to say these things when you're not put in that situation. But I guess I could say it as a parent. My wife and I have come to understand that it's a compliment that when he gives you a child who has a different path. It's certainly not a sign that he doesn't care about you. It's a sign that somehow he puts you in a group of people who has a more important tafkid, not a less important tafkid.
Thank you for sharing that. I'd like to move forward. We have a lot to talk about, and time is moving past us. So I'll ask both of you once again. Rabbi Penner, you said that you wish someone had talked to you 3 days after Gedalia came out rather than 5 years later. In general, what advice would you give to a parent when a child comes out and they are in shock, presumably, or maybe they're not in shock, but they don't know what to say at that exact moment? If you could tell them, how should they react and what should they say? What advice would you give them?
It's probably a lot of things, and I'm curious to hear what Rabbi Horowitz, who's really a specialist at keeping families together, is going to add to this. But I think the most important thing when families get on with me and my wife, we generally do the session. Sometimes they meet first with my wife and I. Sometimes they meet first with Rabbi Horowitz. Sometimes they meet first with Rabbi Rappaport. And it depends sort of what their needs are and, how they can best, be met with that with this initial conversation. But I think that the most important thing that we try to relate to parents, and they get this not through any words that we say, but just looking at the two of us, is that you're going to get through this as a family. It's a challenge, and families have challenges, and very often life is not exactly what you expected, but you can do this. And we say to them, the reason why we're not crying on this conversation is not because we weren't crying 15 years ago, but because we were given advice and we came to learn certain things that allowed our family to be together, to keep our relationship whole, and to keep our relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu whole. So just that sense that I don't know how we're going to get there, but that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us tremendous, tremendous resources and resilience to be able to get to the other side of something. And I think that's something, Rabbi Horowitz can certainly speak about in our work, and he sees this much more than we do, the resilience of meeting people and then seeing them 2 years later and understanding that you can get through the most unimaginable things. And this is not in the realm of unimaginable, certainly in the things Rabbi Horowitz deals with. This is lightweight compared to some of the challenges that he sees in families. Kadosh Baruch Hu gives you the strength that you're not going to see it in the first 2 days. You're not going to see it, but you can remain a family. You can all remain a Jewish family. You can have a loving relationship, and then we'll have to figure out how we're going to get there.
Rabbi Horowitz?
If the parents were the first ones that the child told, I would very, very strongly encourage parents to say, thank you. We're honored that you were close enough to come confide in us. And then we're glad that you had the courage to tell us, because it'll only help us give you the best quality of life. I think parents should tell them that we will always love you, no matter what happens. We will always love you. It's okay to say, whoa, we need to learn a lot. We don't know anything about this at all, but we're going to seek guidance. That's an okay thing to say, and that we're going to figure it out. We're going to make it work. It took me a while to realize this, but my approach to families staying together through stuff, 30 years ago, when I was working with teens at risk, most people advise parents to send away an unreligious child once they're adult child or late teens that abandon religion, to send them away. They're going to impact the other kids. When I said that I don't recommend that people do this, it was whoa. My feeling about families and getting through this, I had great role models with my own parents. And I want to tell every parent who has an issue like this or other things like this in your family, your kids are watching and they're absorbing the messages that you give. And when you tell your child and especially the other children, look, kids, this is very difficult for us, but we're a family and we're going to figure this out. My parents remarried in 1966. My dad died 2 years earlier, and my parents remarried. At that time, the majority of my friends who had step-parents were calling them Fetri Shloima, Uncle Shloima, or Aunt Rivki to their step-parent. And most of them adopted the name, change the name of, like, I would have changed my name from Horowitz to Nudovic. And my parents just, that wasn't the way they did it. They just said, we're a family, we're going to figure this out. And they did it. They just pulled it off. There was never an issue with them. We have a younger sister, yours, mine, and ours. We have an older brother. And it was extraordinarily unusual the way they did it, but they had a vision and they stuck to it. So I think not only is it important for this child, I think it's important for all your children. Because if your message is that if you do X, Y, or Z, you can't be part of our family, what are the other kids thinking? I mean, if I do and if I don't, I mean, we call this in Torah talk, we call it the Havashi Tluya B'davar. It's a love that's conditional on some things. It doesn't mean you're not disappointed. It doesn't mean you're not heartbroken. It doesn't mean you're not confused. But I think that would be the nicest thing you can tell your child is, sweetheart, we're going to figure it out. And it's okay if you say, I don't know how. We have to go seek guidance, but we're going to get through this together.
Okay,
I
thank you
think
for
people
that.
could mistake that. People could mistake that for approving and supporting and pushing them. That's not what Rabbi Horowitz is saying in every way. But it's important to understand, if it's based on a relationship that is unconditional, then within that relationship, you can work with your child. Not every child is only attracted to the opposite, to the same sex. Your child may have other options. There may be things you'll play a role. But I couldn't agree more with what Rabbi Horowitz said. If the initial reaction has to be unconditional love, then they can feel safe enough for you to continue to play a role in your life. But as long as they think that a time may come, and for us, it took many years for us to really get this. As long as Gedalia wasn't sure that we were going to stick with him on this journey till the end, we couldn't, our relationship couldn't exist in the present, because it was unclear what it was going to be in the future. So we're not saying chas v'shalom that you're going to approve of everything. You're not going to discuss the difficulties. You're going to become a cheerleader. But it has to start with this understanding that 1,000% the way Rabbi Horowitz said it, that we're a family. We're going to make this work. And that's dafka. It gives you the ability to then continue to be a parent to your child.
Rabbi Penner, something you just said now, and all of you've said until now has been so important, but it makes me think of something that, again, I spoke with my co-host, Tali Rosenbaum, about when you mentioned that they might have other choices. So let me make a few statements that I assume you'll agree with, but you can tell me if you don't. I assume that we agree that conversion therapy is not a good thing, that this is not something which people should do. There also is the possibility that a child may not know what his or her sexual identity is, meaning it's not exactly a binary all the time. For example, just because someone has had a same-sex experience does not mean that person is inherently gay. It might be something else. And I guess my question is, and perhaps it's not answerable in this context today, but at what point does a parent accept and say, okay, I unconditionally, I accept you, you're gay, and we'll figure it out, versus saying, well, are you sure? Which is sort of a strange thing to say, but it's not always so simple. So how do you balance that, if that's even possible to do?
You want to take this, Rabbi Horowitz? Should I start?
I imagine you have more expertise. I'll be glad to.
It's so reparative therapy doesn't seem to work. I'm not going to comment on whether or not, if reparative therapy would work, whether or not there might be a requirement to engage in something that would make it easier for you to participate in a typical halachic life. But what we've seen, and I'm not an expert on this, I have still not met a single person in 15 years who has come to me, and I invite listeners in the podcast to come to me, who says that therapy has changed their basic attraction to one side or the other. There are individuals who have a small amount of attraction to men, and they may be obsessing about it because it's weird and it's prohibited. And, so we all know that the extent to which sexuality in general lives in our minds can be expanded and potentially contracted. But that's different than the urge itself. So it couldn't recommend anybody to do it because I have yet to see. Forgetting about the dangers potentially and the bad stories, it doesn't seem to work. I think that reparative therapy a little bit is based on the concept that it couldn't be. I've heard Rabbanim say it couldn't be that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would create people like this. And I respond with due respect that it's not for us to say what HaKadosh Baruch Hu can and can't do. Avram Avinu could say, Chalil Ulacha. Who's for me to say what HaKadosh Baruch Hu could or couldn't do? I think there are many people who are bisexual. There are many people who are not. There are many people who are only attracted and have absolutely no attraction to the opposite sex, but there are many people who are bisexual. I think that a parent can be one to explore with the child as to whether or not they have attraction to the opposite sex, etc. But we all know that parenting is a tafkid, and parenting is love, and parenting is also strategy. Is the parent the best person to have this conversation with the child? Many parents, from our experience, know we're the worst person to have many conversations with our children. Parents feel that they're chayav to have the conversation with the child because that's part of what parenting is strategy. There's what to say that it may be best for the parent to stay away from pushing too hard because that's going to be needed to keep the parental relationship there. But it doesn't mean that the parent can't drop a hint, that the parent can't encourage them to speak to somebody else about it. It is important just because a person has a homosexual, let's say, a same-sex attraction, and that doesn't mean that they can't possibly have a typical relationship going forward. It's complicated. You need to be dealing with professionals and rabbanim, etc. But a parent needs to know how they're going to best be able to play, a positive role in their child's life. And I think that that's true, Rabbi Horowitz, all your experience with children who take different paths. It's it's not really about what should be done. It's about what's going to have the best result. And parents need a lot of advice and a lot of siyata dishmaya to figure that out.
When people will tell me, well, it's a choice, and use this as a proof and say, how could Hashem have made a prohibition against gay relations and then make people gay? And that's not possible. Like, it's kind of circular logic. So here's my response, a little out of the box. I tell them like this. I said, be honest about your biases. I said, if you believe, as I do, that some people, I'm not saying that every person that says that, just like you said, by the way, I tell parents, go to a therapist and explore whether a man is attracted to another man. Go explore that with a therapist and talk it over and say, maybe it's just this person. Maybe I'm in an all-boys environment, gender segregated school and life. So explore that with the therapist. But when people say it can't be that people are born this way because how could God? So I tell them, just get in touch with your bias. If you believe, as I do, that some people, or many or most people, like Rabbi Menachem said, who come and say they're gay, this is what it is. If you believe as I do, you have less of a problem with the people because you understand their tremendous nisayon, the tremendous challenge, spiritual challenge. But then you have a God problem, right? Then you have a real God problem, which I try to work my way through every time I get off a conversation like that, or someone comes and talks to me about that. Like, I'm like, what? Right? So you have a real God problem. If you believe
everybody could change.
If you believe everybody could change, that stops you from having your God problem. So again, if you believe that people can change, some people can't change, let's say, or most people can't change, or all people can't change, that gives you a terrible God problem. If you believe that people could change, so you have a huge problem with the people who don't want to change, but it absolves you of your God problem. I said, cut it out. You don't want to have a God problem. So you're biased. In other words, you're biased in how you're interpreting this because you don't want to have this tremendous spiritual challenge that gay people have. And by extension, those of us who deal with gay people and recognize the struggle and hear them pouring their hearts out and saying, well, what am I supposed to do? I think people don't realize how many of our LGBTQ young men and women are desperate for a relationship, for a meaningful relationship with God, and ask questions. How could you do this to me? They come to me and other people and themselves, and they say, I love Hashem, I love the Torah. I don't think people realize that. And almost everybody that I know that went through this journey and decided that they couldn't live alone and got into a relationship, almost all of them went through the time that they tried to figure it out, and they were trying to search for answers and search for Hashem and trying to I don't think people realize that what a struggle it is until the point that they made that choice.
It's important to understand, by the way, in addition, that bisexuality, the reality of bisexuality complicates this tremendously on a community level. And that's, I know that you've asked us questions about community policy. If everyone who was gay was only attracted to the same sex and really had no option to have a meaningful, loving, typical marriage with someone of the opposite sex, I think we might approach the issue one way publicly. But we have to remember that as we work to explain to people what this is and what it isn't, as we work to slightly destigmatize, if that's the right word, to better understand the struggles and to make them real, we have to remember that for everyone in the audience who's listening, who's gay, 100% gay, there's a lot of people in the audience listening who are bisexual. Now, being bisexual is not as simple as saying you could go either way. That's not, it's complicated. It's complicated. It's complicated in our society. But let's say that there's in our audience a whole group of people who could marry a woman and could marry a man, men who could marry a woman and could marry a man. And especially I find this amongst ladies who could marry a woman and could marry a man. How do you relieve the stigma so that people who are gay can feel part of our community, but, and I say this very carefully, maintain enough stigma or enough encouragement that someone who's attracted to both men and women won't say, why should I choose one over the other? It's such a difficult situation.
That is so
tough.
You're right.
You obviously want to keep a norm where anyone who can is marrying the opposite sex. And you don't want to just say, well, you know, we're going to love everybody and it's wonderful. And we do love everybody. How do you sort of keep up that balance? It's so difficult. And I know so many people who are gay, who claim to be, I don't know what's inside, who claim to be equally attracted to both sexes, and people who claim to be not attracted at all to the opposite sex. So, and that makes us so, it makes us worry. It makes us, every time I speak publicly, every time I'm on a podcast, am I helping or am I hurting? Am I helping one person and hurting another person in their decision? And that's why it's so hard we can't not speak publicly, because not everyone's going to approach us one by one. We need podcasts, and we're so thankful to you to be taking up this issue. We need to speak publicly, but we need to always venture into that space that we need to maintain Torah values. We need to maintain the idea that, of course, the goal is to be in a, if you can be, and if you can find a partner, to be in a heterosexual marriage. And of course, that's the goal, but that we're not going to pretend that we really understand you if that's impossible for you, and the decisions that you make, they're choices, but they're choices that we can't begin to understand what goes through the cheshbon in your mind when you're making them. That's what makes this so complicated.
And Rabbi Penner, what you're saying now relates directly to something that Rabbi Horowitz said he heard after our previous podcast, when he was saying that we need to try to change attitudes towards people without compromising the halacha. And you've said that as well, Rabbi Penner. And is it even possible to do that? It's almost this very difficult dance where we talk about the difference between acceptance and approval, and we can accept without approving. And yet at the same time, is that really just splitting hairs and pretending to be able to do something, which practically speaking on the ground is much more difficult than it sounds in a nice soundbite?
Right. And that's why public policy, I think, will never be able to be as easily dealt with as individual cases, individual people, individual instruction. So we're stuck. If we leave everything to conversations behind closed doors, then most people won't know what to do. But if we come out too publicly and we try to create sweeping public policies and this and that, then what we're saying will be wrong for many, will be the wrong advice for many people and for many situations and for many shuls.
Rabbi Rappaport said something at the closing of this last year's Shabbaton, and I cannot recommend strongly enough to parents who have LGBTQ children to go to it's this year's is earlier than last year's. It's going to be in February. I cannot stress enough how valuable it is for parents of LGBTQ kids to be that incredible, uplifting swirls of emotion, draining, all of it. It's so helpful to parents. Rabbi Rappaport closed on Sunday afternoon, lunchtime, and he said, we're all on a Gesher Tzar Ma'od. He quoted Rabbi Nachman of Breslov that said that the world is a narrow bridge, and Kol Olam Kulo Gesher Tzar Ma'od. The world is a narrow bridge. The thing is, don't be afraid. V'ikar shelo lefachid klal, not to be afraid. So he said, there are some people who say we have to respect the Torah completely, and anybody who cannot or won't accommodate, keep the Torah, and especially if it's publicly, then we have to set aside our children and maintain a relationship with them. And there are some people who will say you have to maintain your relationship with the children, and the Torah is going to have to be put aside. He said, we all are in this narrow bridge where we believe in the Almighty with every fiber in our body, and we believe and love our children with every fiber in our body, and we're walking this dance, this narrow path together to love our children unconditionally, to be with them, to support them, and at the same time, with every fiber in our being, respect and love HaKadosh Baruch Hu, love God. I'd like to add a thought of my own on Rav Nachman's thought. That was a very popular song after the Yom Kippur War, that our holy soldiers, our IDF members, were on. So my take on Rav Nachman's, like there are some people who say Rav Nachman said, "Don't be afraid, just be happy." I understand it differently. Rav Nachman wasn't talking about the GW bridge. I believe that Rav Nachman was talking about a little footbridge over a stream. The nature of the fear is that when people get frightened, that the limbs shake and they fall, not only because it's a narrow bridge, but because it's a narrow bridge and they're afraid. So the fear creates the instability that makes them fall. And that's something that I often tell parents, that this Gesher Tzar Ma'od, if you're walking along the path and trying to do both, to have faith in your ability to do it. Because when we don't feel empowered by this faith, that we can get to the other side and love our children, love HaKadosh Baruch Hu, have a Jewish home, and make space for a child who's different, the fear sometimes can get you to make poor decisions. And when we believe in our ability, it's easy for me to say, but when we're self-confident that we can do this, and that comes from getting advice from the Penners and getting advice from peers and learning and studying and doing everything you can to learn, that builds the self-confidence that allows us to get to the other side.
That's such a beautiful and important idea. I believe that Rabbi Menachem also said along those same lines that a person has to have patience with everybody, especially yourself.
Yeah.
On that level, that's what you're saying. It's about,
right.
So thank you for that. I know we don't have much time left. I have two more questions I'd like to ask, if it's okay. The first question is in terms of, I guess I'm asking through Kesher Families and in general, what both of you have seen change both inside and outside of the Orthodox community over the past decade vis-a-vis issues regarding LGBTQ individuals. Has there been a major change, or have things remained roughly the same? Rabbi Penner?
I think parents are responding much more in much more the way like Rabbi Horowitz described before. And we tend to be shocked and just blown away by parents who come, let's say, from a very, very Haredi place and respond in a way that really keeps the kids very close. They call us 2 days later and they're crying and we cry with them. But in front of the kids, they keep this face. And that's wonderful to see that parents are getting that, because as much as it's great to give us, you asked us what we tell a parent, 3 days later when they call us, well, 3 days later may be too late. So the fact that many of them are getting this message before their child comes out,
Yes.
I think there's an understanding that this is a real thing and that it exists in our community. How to grapple with it, how to deal with it, I don't know that we know. I wouldn't say progress hasn't been made, as if to say we know what to do and people aren't willing to do it. It remains a tremendous question as to how to integrate, how to make this work. But I do think that there's much more of an understanding that this is real, that this exists in many families. We don't know, the percentages and the numbers, but it's not 0.001%. It's a kid in every class. It's probably multiple kids, one or two kids on every block in a frum neighborhood, if not more. And that I think it challenges us. We can't hide from it. Rabbi Horowitz has again and again brought issues to the community that they just can't pretend don't exist. And that, I think, is the most important first step. You don't always know how to deal with it, but if we pretend that it's not there, or it's a couple of kids here and a couple of kids there, and then we can never really, fulfill our role as community leaders and as parents.
Yeah, I think as the numbers are growing leaps and bounds, not only the numbers are growing, but it's also, we find out more about, that there are children out there that other people are dealing with. And another very big factor is the generational attitude towards this. And the fact that our children who are straight are much more likely to be empathetic than my generation or a generation above this. It really makes a difference. I tell people all the time, when people say nasty, when people talk smack about this issue, and they say stuff to me, whatever, I hear them saying things, I tell them, you just be careful. I say, what do your children say when you say that? When you say something, disrespectful to LGBTQ people overall, like, what do your kids say? I have a daughter, she's like in her 20s, and she says, I'm a Neanderthal and a horrible person. And, and I said, really? I said, mark my words. Put a marker there. If 5 years from now she tells you that she doesn't want to be religious because religious people are intolerant, just remember that what you're doing now is dangerous to your children's faith. You shouldn't do it because it's wrong.
Mm.
That's one thing. But if your children are saying you're a Neanderthal, a lot of them are just thinking it, and they turn around and you have no idea. I don't wish it on anybody, but that might come back to bite you. And I've seen this. I've heard this from adolescents. Kids, I work with kids who are on the fringe or beyond, and it comes up from time to time. And unfortunately, in the political world, among certain circles, in the general population, it's become fashionable. It's a nice political tool to talk about transgender in a horrible way. We don't have to follow that example. We shouldn't follow because it's wrong, but it's also not presenting our Torah in the way that we want our children to know about it.
From what you're both saying, such important points. And I'm thinking, Rabbi Yaakov, what you just said, as well as Rabbi Penner, you said 3 days later might be too late. My own thought right now, again, speaking certainly as a non-expert, we talk about this ahava she'eina tluya b'davar, unconditional love. And if a parent decides to implement unconditional love when their child tells them something they don't want to hear, it's too late. Maybe, if nothing else, parents should always be working on making sure that their love for their children is unconditional and demonstrate that it's unconditional. Therefore, when, and all children tell parents things at some point the parents don't want to hear, whether it's that they're gay or anything else. The parent will be prepared at least not to react in a way which, as you said, Rabbi Penner, ooh, it's 3 days too late. That shouldn't be your initial reaction. If a parent is always careful that their number one priority vis-a-vis their love in their children is that it's unconditional, when a child says something, almost by definition, it doesn't mean you'll say the right thing, but you won't say the wrong thing. I think that's probably at least likely, in my opinion.
But it's also important to express to them that you have another unconditional love for the Ribbon Shalom. And very often we don't express to our kids our love for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, our commitment to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, our love for Yiddishkeit. When we were grappling with our son about this, about a wedding and thing, he understood that we loved him deeply and that we love HaKadosh Baruch Hu deeply. And that we were trying to negotiate how to make this work, what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted us to do, whether he wanted us to emphasize our role as parents or emphasize our role just as Yidden and as public people. And, I've said to others, if the first time that he hears that you love him, and the first time that he realizes that you love the Ribbon Shalom is when you're deciding whether to participate in a particular event in his life, it's going to fall very flat. Our kids are up against so much in society today, and there's so many things that they're facing. They need to hear from us what we care about and what our values are. I'd say people at the Pesach Seder, you spend a whole night with all your kids and your grandkids at the table, and you just tell them gematrias. And you need to turn to them and say, I believe in God. I believe God runs the world. I believe God can change our circumstances. And you sound like an idiot for saying that, because who says things like that? You're supposed to say some vort out of your Haggadah and this and that. Again, it's crazy for me to discuss this in front of a gadol and parenting advice of Rabbi Horowitz. But just because you got me started, you have to tell your kids what matters to you long before the bump in the road, long before there's the train wreck, long before there's the difficult conversation. Not only will it make them much more likely to have the conversation with you in the first place, but they'll believe you when you say, as Rabbi Horowitz said before, we're struggling with this. We're trying to figure this out. Know what you care about, know what your values are, and find opportunities to say it in so many words, straight eye to eye to your kids.
Amazing. Okay. My final question to both of you now is sort of a summation, a conclusion. If there is one thing, and we've been speaking for quite a while, but if there's one thing that you would like our listeners to take away from this conversation vis-a-vis the issue regarding Orthodoxy and the LGBTQ individuals, what would that thing be? What would you want the takeaway to be? Rabbi Penner?
It's complicated. If you think that either side, it's not complicated, halacha is also complicated, but not what the Torah says about. The pasuk that deals with male homosexuality is not a complicated pasuk, but this issue is complicated. If you think one side or one way approach is definitely right, definitely wrong when it comes to how we deal with this as a family or as a community, you have to admit that it's complicated. And at the end of the day, we have to realize that these are not issues. These are people. These are people. These are not movements. These are not parades. These are not flags. These are people. And if we keep those two things in mind, that it's complicated, but they're real people in real families, and they're Jews, and they're part of our community, and we need to figure out how to make this work, then I believe we'll certainly move to a better place than the one we're in now. I wish I could define it exactly. I don't know. I don't have the answers. But I think those are the two
if I can
two
add,
pieces.
Rabbi Menachem, to what you said, their parents are people, their siblings are people, their grandparents people. And I cannot tell you how many people, 7, 8, 9, that I know of, that moved out of their neighborhoods after having a gay child because they were so hurt by the reaction of their friends. They just couldn't live there anymore. And I'm sure you know more than I do, Rabbi Menachem, but that should never happen. Did I interrupt you? I did interrupt you, Menachem. Did you finish your thought?
You continued it beautifully.
So let me tell you mine.
I
My
hear
take
you, Rabbi
on
Horowitz.
all of you. The one thing I'd like you, parents and folks to walk away from this incredible conversation. Again, thank you, Rabbi Scott. Thank you, Rabbi Menachem.
Thank you, Shkad.
I spent Shabbos at an addiction recovery retreat run by a wonderful Chabad shliach here in Florida years ago. And I happened to have gone without Uri, so I felt more at liberty to walk around, or I was more restless, I'm not sure. So I wanted to meet the people, so I went from table to table. I pulled up a chair, just schmoozing, just probably 300, 400, 500 people. It was a very big crowd. And I came to, in the corner, there was a large Hasidic family. They had, I would say, 20 people or more, 3 generations. There was grandparents, our age, and a few married children and their children. So I just sat down, was schmoozing with them, talked to them, and I did, of course, I didn't ask him about his name or anything. I just, everything. It's a safe space. Anyway, so I walked around this room of people, who were in addiction recovery, and I came to this table with this large Hasidic family, and I left. So one of the young ladies, either a daughter or a daughter-in-law, my children's age, our children's age in the 30s, whatever. And she tells me in Yiddish, she says, Rabbi Horowitz, we're not all addicts. So she said, the whole family, we're not all addicts. So I said, what? So she said, you probably think that whoever's here is in recovery. You probably think that the whole family is addicted to drugs. So I looked at her, I said, so she said, "Man breeders, I'm sorry." She said, "Man breeders do. My brother is here." And there was one kid there, visibly not religious, and everybody else was completely Hasidish. Oy, man breeders do. Wir sind do. We came because he's here. And we want to support his recovery. So we all came. And I can tell you that, for those young couples that had 6, 8, 10-year-old children, I'm sure it wasn't the first choice of where to be for Shabbos. With everybody talking about drugs and recovery and all of that. Just, eres du, wir sind du. She says, wir sind in einer Sprache. That's the line I would love for people to walk away with, whether it's your own family or trying to support another family. She said it, and she was fortunate that she saw that just like I did. She saw it from her parents, that those parents didn't give up on their child. So they all made the sacrifice to come because that's what they picked up from their parents. We're a family. And we just stick together. And it's interesting, Chazal say that Hashem goes to Golus when we do. Hashem comes along with us. That's what I thought of when I saw that couple.
Mm-hmm.
It said, I'm with you. So Hashem is with us. And think about your own families. We're family. And families do things together.
Okay, well, I can say it has been a deeply personally moving episode, and I'm so grateful to both of you, Rabbi Penner, Rabbi Horowitz, for opening your hearts, opening your minds, and being so forthright to share with everyone listening and with me your experiences and your thoughts and your hearts. And I just hope that our listeners will take the messages that we've had, the paradoxes that we have to live with, the difficulty of walking that narrow bridge, and understanding that it's not easy. There aren't easy answers. But unconditional love, as you said, Rabbi Penner, to both our children and to the Master of the universe. And as you said, Rabbi Horowitz, that we're all a family. Taking those messages and tying it all together, hopefully will at least make the journey, which is a difficult one, a little bit easier to navigate. And I thank you both very, very much. Thank you very much.
It's KesherFamilies.org. Parents, it's KesherFamilies.org. Everything Every single service is free except for the Shabbaton, and it's heavily, heavily subsidized for parents, for people who need a break. And it is the most confidential space I've ever worked in. They are so careful about confidentiality. I just want to tell you, our daughter brought one of our grandchildren to see us when we were there, and we drove half a mile down the road because we picked up this culture. I didn't tell you about that, Rabbi Menachem, did I?
No.
No, we told her to meet us down the road because we saw how careful the Penners were and the leadership team there about maintaining confidentiality. KesherFamilies.org.
It'll be completely confidential. The services are free, and it is our honor to be able to meet you. We grow from every experience with every parent. And don't just say, we think we're okay, or what's being what are we going to gain from the conversation? Being with other parents, being in the room, being on the phone, being on a Zoom. It's incredibly uplifting. So please join our Kesher family.
And anyone who would like to contact Kesher Families, we'll put a link of that in the description of this podcast. Thank you both.
Be well. Thanks again.